it becomes hard.
Yes. All right. We're gonna get started here. Welcome everyone. It's really nice to see you all. Glad to see you all have some food already. That's great. Thanks to Kirsten for setting that up, who is not in here, even though last week was her birthday and I was gonna embarrass her. But that's where the donuts are. They're celebrating Kirsten's birthday.
The recorded thing you can tell.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Anyhow, thanks everyone. It's nice to see you all. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Scott Page, who is I had to write this down. So the number of different titles and affiliations that Scott has. The John Seeley Brown Distinguished University Professor of Complexity, Social Science, and Management at the University of Michigan. He's also the Williamson Family Professor of Business Administration, Professor of Management and Organizations at the Stephen Ross School of Business, Professor of Political Science, Complex Systems, and Economics at Ellison, which is the school at University of Michigan. He's also an external faculty member at the Santa Fe Institute, and editor-in-chief of the journal Collective Intelligence as well. So in addition to the sort of diversity and number of titles and affiliations, I have to say that Scott is perhaps one of the most interesting people I've ever met. His research focuses on the function of diversity in complex social systems, potential for collective intelligence, the design of institutions for meeting the challenges of a complex world. He's written 5 books on these topics that I'm aware of, and published in journals across a sort of astoundingly wide range of disciplines, from like geography, political science, complexity, and organizational studies. He consults on a wide range of problems, helping people make better decisions and more effective decisions in complex contexts. And I have to say, his ideas have inspired me since I was a grad student at Michigan throughout my own research for years. So I am so delighted to introduce Professor Page to give us a fantastic overview of his research on the possibility of, this is a different title. It says not fair. No longer bootstrapping social norms, which I was like, I memorized. On the possibility of high dimensional social progress, which I'm equally excited to hear about. As usual, clarifying questions during the presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have our first question come from a grad student. Again, thank you all for coming, and please being Professor Scott.
Thanks, guys. It is great to be here. And I had Myra Zellner, who is also one of my former grad students who's at Northeastern University, who does story modeling, and some of the other people on our committee who are now retired were together. And it's kind of like you feel like it's so great to see your students doing so much better than you were doing at a similar stage in their career. So it's so great to see Jess as well, just kind of like taking over the Ostrom workshop. My wife, Jana Bednar, who's on here, has been here several times. This is my first time here. And also this is completes kind of the dream, right? I've been to every other Big Ten school to give a talk, and this is Indiana completes the list. So it is a great honor to be here. And someone wanted to ask me, how did you ever get Eleanor Ostrom to endorse your books? And I said, well, I had my wife endorse her husband's book. The little tit for tat worked out to my advantage. So what I want to change the title of this a little bit. What I want to do is talk about a couple papers in some detail, but kind of a larger project, which is trying to make some sense of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 dimensional. There's 17 dimensions. There's 169 sub goals, and there's 247 metrics on those. And so you think about, like, even like something like Arrow's theorem, like we can't even decide on like one thing, right? This seems like it's almost an impossibility. So what I'm going to talk very quickly about the goals, and I'm going to get, this is in quotes, I'm going to be somewhat snarky here, what I mean by interdependence. And I'm going to walk through this kind of new project that Jen and I've been working on kind of a multiple stag hunt framework. And then at the end, if time permits, I'll talk about this general question about congruence, because I came to dinner last night and I realized that maybe it makes sense to fold that in. Just some background. I mean, like our younger son Cooper was like 13. Somebody said, what do your parents do? And he said, my mom is like a world expert on federalism. She was all about federalism, especially Canada, America. And my dad says simple things to smart people, which was accurate as hell. And so this will fit in with that. But this is, I wrote this book. Dickens says David Copperfield is his favorite child. This is maybe my favorite child, this book, The Model Thinker. And this is a book where what I'm really trying to do is not social scientists. A lot of times we try and explain things or predict or design or, take actions. Here, I'm just really, even though I've been doing this now for like 10 or 15 years, still just trying to figure out how to act in this space. So here's the Sustainable Development Goals. They're color coded, which makes it easier. There's 169 targets, 247 indicators, right? So this is just beyond anyone's person's ability to correct these. So when they came up with these supplanted the Millennium Goals, the idea was we'll just, work on these kind of one at a time. Well, what very quickly occurred to people, like maybe like about 2 months after they released it, is these things are wildly interdependent. But you get these scorecards, and this is kind of the European Union, these different parts. Someone can say, how are we doing on these things? And the reality is we're doing well on a lot, except carbon is kind of an outlier. But there was a sense where, trained as an economist, we think about like efficient frontiers. And if you go back to like James Mead, it was kind of like this notion of an equality efficiency trade-off. And that was a nice convex frontier. And one might think, oh, I can just throw sustainability in and have a three-dimensional frontier. And then I can just quickly drop in 14 other dimensions and have a 17-dimensional frontier. And I can take out my convex analysis book and find the hyperplane that's tangent, and then we're done. That's fantastic. But then something kind of happened that made that not work, which is as they started measuring these goals, they realized there was a lot of interdependence. And here's the report in 2015. They say interlinkages and integrated nature of the Sustainable Development Goals are of crucial importance to its implementation. Here's where, like, as someone who's trained as a mathematical modeler, I kind of ran into some difficulties because, like, there's these words: interdependence, synergies, systems effects, externalities. The keyboard words are just kind of like thrown out, and they're not formally defined. So one way to think about kind of interdependence would be that there might be kind of like a rugged landscape. And again, this is a two-dimensional rugged landscape. It's like a two-dimensional policy space. And you want to somehow think in 17 dimensions. So let that go. But the idea there could be different peaks. Now, this particular problem isn't that bad because as long as you're on any one of the three peaks, they're about the same. What we worry about is if some peaks are much, much better than other peaks. This is one of my favorite graphs of all time because it says, so let me look up, I can't click off the OK thing. I don't know how to do that, but no. There we go. So this is interlinkages, which if you've studied any, that is not a mathematical term of any sort. So it's not good what interlinkage means. I think it just means that I can draw a map and show that these things are related. This is just between responsible consumption and the other SDGs. This is just, all these things are kind of empirical studies showing relationships. And here's what's beautiful. Here's what it says at the bottom of this graph. This is to stimulate discussion and is not a comprehensive overview. Which just gives you a sense of like the sheer number of interlinkages. So a kind of like meta project I'm working on is this question of like, how do we do, and then with the title of the talk, how do we do policy, how do we do social science on these giant maps, right? And the color coding is useful here because each color is a different SDG. And so you can kind of get a sense of like, this is connected to this, is connected to this. Okay. Now the question is, who makes these graphs? Who are these people, right? And how do they do it? And there's essentially three ways they do it. And Nielsen is probably the person to look up if you want to get kind of a reference to how this all got started. And one is that there's expert knowledge graphs. And so what'll happen is like each country has their own, we'll talk about this in a minute, each country has their own graphs and networks and stuff, but they'll get people like us together, experts, and we all sit around and we draw arrows. And if we agree on the arrow, there's an interlinkage. That's one way to do it. Another way to do is you have experts score, and then you use Delphi method and you try and big in data. And it's not just people chatting about, I think there's interaction. But here you're trying to, I should say Delphi, this is the type of, you're trying to actually bring in empirical work. And then a third way, the way most countries do this is just do correlations. You just sort of say, okay, hey, guess what? So if I go back to the scorecard, it's like I happen to have a scorecard of 247 indicators. And I just hit this return key in state and I can get correlation. And then if the correlation is above a threshold, I can draw the arrow. So that's one reason why you get those crazy, crazy maps. And but it's fun to look at these. So here's again, broad scale, all of them. And you look at kind of like, they distinguish between like synergies and trade-offs. So synergies like poverty and education, poverty and gender equality, poverty and inequality, poverty and clean water, education and inequality, poverty and well-being, education and well-being, water and well-being. Those all make sense. The trade-off, you're like, whoa, number 12 is in here all the time. Yeah, responsible consumption, right? So like doing things in an environmental way tends to cost you on all those other things you'd like to do. So it's kind of like most of the externalities and synergies and interlinkages or whatever they're going to call them are positive. Like we'll look at some other graphs, the great majority are positive. Unfortunately, the negative column is all like economic well-being, right? Which means oops. So here's one. Here's like a country level one. And this is so Switzerland. So this is a case. They all have these great titles like the case of Switzerland, as though like there was a murder somewhere in Switzerland. And you see like this one. Whoa! Here's blue is good, orange is bad. This is responsible consumption and growth, right? So that's everything else is kind of positive. And they count up. They do these things like count how many are positive, count how many are negative, positive in degree, positive out degree, to try and this is super cool because what they're really doing, and again, let's set aside the empirical foundations of how strong the data is supporting this, but what they're really trying to do is kind of give us some sort of understanding of these 247 indicators or 17 goals or 260, whatever they are, which ones are creating a lot of positive things out there in the world, right? And which ones are take in a lot of positive things from other things in the world. And presumably that helps guide where we put our energy. That's kind of the thinking. What's also fun, John MacArthur, who is my boss, well, he left to go become chief domestic policy advisor for Canada at Brookings. He was really big on every one of the countries' maps like this all look different. So that makes it really hard. This is like, so when you think about it, and this is why I was super happy to come give this talk here, the Ostrom workshop, you really have to have local knowledge on all these things. It turns out, I quizzed my undergrads on this, what's missing from Switzerland? None of the ocean metrics. It turns out the Swiss just don't care about the ocean. They don't have one, right? So Uruguay and Switzerland are the only countries that get, like, there's very few countries that don't, Vatican, but most countries do care about the oceans, but they don't because it doesn't really affect them downstream. Now you can do this then, you can take any one thing, you can go way down into these like small farmer production, like this is SDG 23A, and look at its impact of and the impact on it, right? So this is kind of like in versus out, and kind of like everything is good on it, but it's not good on everything, right? So you can see that like looking at in degree and out degree, right, makes a difference. But the ratio, again, notice more good than bad, which if you look at this from a complex systems perspective is fantastic because you're essentially saying a lot of externalities here, a lot of interdependency, system effects will sort out what we mean by those, but in general good, right? But they're also not random. You can look at it, fascinating to me is you can look at this through different lenses. So here's just looking at things that relate to kind of urban life. This spins around. So SD, by the way, wow, this is like a zoo of graphs. This is like take away these people's PowerPoint slides. It's just like every time you look at one, you're like, whoa. So this one, the SDGs are spinning this way, which doesn't help at all. They didn't color code them. But like, what's interesting, synergies, the one that has all the synergies is partnerships for the goals. Well, no kidding, right? So but at least you know then they're kind of getting it right. But also sustainable cities has a lot, right? Gender equality, not much, right? And like there's nothing going to clean energy from a synergy standpoint in cities. Trade-offs, right? There's some going to energy. But there's really nothing, which is interesting, nothing on a negative side going to good health and well-being, gender equality, or quality education. So that's passes the sniff test, and it's also like a good thing. It's hard to imagine like anything bad happening with respect to those if you're thinking about how do you make a city better, right? Like educating people, reducing poverty, helping women probably is going to make the city better. And if you make the city better, you're also probably going to like help those communities. Here's, if you like interesting graphs, here's another one. This is just looking at like the marine. So this is the marine stuff, blue. This is helpful. You realize colors are super helpful when you're in 17 dimension. And here's the SDGs. Sometimes, and these people should be taken out and like forced to go to a presentation, they change the colors of these. Like, so after a while, if you looked at enough of these, like you remember what color means what. And you're like, did you just really do that to me? I emailed someone, I'm like, really? Come on. But, and you'll notice like poverty and zero hunger, a lot of good stuff with water, right? And clean and affordable energy, not much, right? Except for on islands. But here's the challenge with this, and all that when you have correlational data, or if you have experts sitting in the room, but less so that experts sitting in the room, but it's still a problem, is the what one of my friends calls the Bob Seger problem. Bob Seger from Ann Arbor, Michigan, has this song where he says, too many people looking back. So in 2022, the International Seabed Authority allowed people to scrape metals from the ocean floors, right? So this is hundreds of hours of work by people looking at sort of marine goals, relatedness to the other things. That was done prior to them allowing scraping of the ocean floors. And so there was no interdependency between clean energy and marine, right? And this should be like a giant negative. So the correlational analysis, I mean, one of the things that, and here's where there's a disconnect that you just kind of struggle with. Some people are counting on technological innovation to kind of lift us up through these things and breakthroughs. And there's breakthroughs in policies, there's technological breakthroughs. The technological breakthroughs are going to change the maps, right? Depending on which one it is. So that's a thing to keep in mind. Okay, so now here's the really, I have a whole comedy routine I give in this. I'll just give the short version. People interchangeably use externalities and systems effects and interlinkages and trade-offs and synergies. And mathematically, these are very different things. And social scientists treat them very, very differently, right? So if you think of a systems effect, right, you think in terms of systems dynamics. And so I took it upon myself to go to the International Systems Dynamics Society meeting, partly because it was in Schaumburg. And if you ask them, they say everything is a systems effect, right? Even externalities are system effects. And I'm like, not really. But the thing is, the system effects really boil into a bunch of like some main categories. One is there's feedback loops where you get exponential growth. There's negative feedback loops that get to kind of our balancing. There's some that kind of like are population-based growth where you get then you get a positive return and then a negative, so it gets S-shaped. Sometimes there's a delay built into the system. And John Sturman says, like, if you're ever in an old hotel and you're trying to get the temperature right? This is why the temperature goes up and down. There's also sometimes these things you can have if you throw delay into one of these growth things and you overshoot the value, you'll go up and down. And there's also things that collapse over time. So but these things are stocks and flow types of models. Okay? Now, one way you can run these things is you just sort of say, and I did this for fun on a bunch of them, where you just take these matrix, right, throw it in and compute the eigenvalues, right? And if it's real and positive, you get exponential growth. If it's real and negative, it should balance. And if it's complex, then you're going to get these oscillations, right? So it's weird. You can just kind of do a gut check. Now, it's not clear that there's any truth to this, but at least you could get, at least as an exercise, it's kind of like fun to do, right? Externalities are a different thing, right? And nobody likes to categorize like a social scientist, right? So social scientists have many types of externalities. Like we have public goods, public bads, we have production externalities, consumption, spatial, unidirectional, reciprocal, reflexive, correlated, uncertain, marginal. And this was as of 1971. So there's a lot of different types of externalities. And when you think about how economists think, this is a paper by Jeffrey Sachs and Mariana Mazzucata. I don't know this person, Mariana was a student of mine. They basically thinking in terms of kind of externalities and a little bit in terms of system effects, basically say, oh, no, there's 6 levels of transformation. You can kind of follow these, right? This transformation affects these. And then, I mean, you look at this and you're like, this has got to be right. No way. No way. Right? No way. Right? Like we're gonna solve. Like, just think of all those maps I drew. And you're gonna be like, we've identified. I'm kind of in fun because Mariana's big fun, but like we've identified the 6 maze transformation. And here's all these lines. So I don't where these lines came from. I don't know. This might just be, but like you realize this is a really complicated, complex process, right? Like how are you exactly going to do this? And because they're economists, right? There's 3 answers, right? This is my favorite picture of Eleanor, but there's taxes and subsidies, there's property rights, and then there's like systems of norms and right. And at least this is kind of like, you know, the Sachs view of things. And the question then is just which of these would be good, right? And then we're going to find those pathways. Now it matters though, I think, whether these things are externalities or system effects, right? And if you look at this chart, you think, how did they come up with these colors? And you're saying, wait, how come these colors are blue and these colors are orange and green? Exactly. No, but this is how they came up with these colors. The bright blue means this and the red means that. But they basically said people sit around and think, there's progress on one, automatically deliver progress on the other. Is it reinforcing? It kind of makes it easier. Or is it enabling just to make it possible to make it so you reinforce it? So this isn't even a scaling, actually, when you look into this. It means taking the eigenvector was very problematic on my part, and I apologize. But it just gives you a sense of like, a lot of this stuff is coming in different ways. But here's where this gets like super interesting, and I'll pull it into like actual research, is where this becomes, I think, really important, especially for like this crowd, is when we think about those things, taxes, subsidies, property rights, norms, you're putting some sort of mechanism. This is kind of the mechanism design framework, institutional design framework in formal political science and economics. You're placing that in some sort of petri dish, which is the culture, which is networks, beliefs, behaviors, all that sort of stuff. And one of the things we know now fairly compellingly is that if you put the exact same institution or game in different forms, you get very different outcomes. So this is the Henrik Bosch Ensminger stuff, right, where they had people play the dictator game, and you go rural Missouri. Nobody from rural Missouri recently moved there. You know, you're the nicest people in the world. Your parents are. And then if you know, and you look at different places, like people offer different amounts of money. And if you try and explain this, it turns out like amount of kind of market penetration kind of correlates with trust. But the thing is, this isn't just randomness, right? There's difference in how much people give. And Jenna, I think, probably gave this paper here. Jenna and I have been trying to think about the following. How is it, kind of a sequencing question, if I put a new institution in play, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to get outcomes from that institution, but I'm also going to affect beliefs, behaviors, social networks, the petri dish. And so, but then when I affect the petri dish, that's going to affect what institutions work well. Right? So there's this kind of feedback between institutions and the petri dish. Okay, so here we wanted to go even simpler. We're going to take kind of the Pigouvian approach and think about spillovers. And we're going to construct a model of like many stag hunts. And the reason I did this, because I know you guys have a deer issue here. Right? So I'm solving it for you right now. So here's a standard stag hunt. Right? And there's 2 equilibria. We kind of, and I'm going to, and I appreciate help on this afterwards. Like, we're kind of calling this collectivist and individualist, but like maybe we should call this trusting, not trusting, because I think that like Michigan will use all federal funding if I say collectivist or something. I'm not sure I have the right word. But now suppose, like, how much of a subsidy would I have to give people to hunt stag in order to make it so this equilibrium goes away? So what I want to think about now is imagine I've got those 17 sustainable development goals and I want to fix them. Right. So I want electric cars, I want clean. So we've got to pay people, right, or invest in the system to have us do this outcome. So I'm gonna make this simpler and just to say, assume that like there's 10 goals or 4 goals or 5 goals or whatever, and each one is a stag hunt. And this is the bad solution, and we want to get to the good solution. Well, this is simple. Economists have solved this, but we just subsidize, right? And so then if I had 3 of them, if I had land, water, and an economic domain, I would just subsidize each one of them too, and it cost me 6, and our work here is done. But that ignores all of the interdependencies. So now let's suppose I want to talk about 2 types of interdependencies. So one is what is in most of those charts, what I'm going to call domain externalities. So, and I'll go straight to Lake Erie. So Lake Erie has a lot of algae. And the reason there's a lot of algae is people on the farms, right, are using a lot of nitrogen, and it's causing the water to turn bad. So if you solve this problem, got to the good equilibrium here, you're going to make this one easier. And who's vacationed on Lake Erie recently? Exactly. If you clean the land and the water, all of a sudden you'd be like, forget the Hamptons. We're going to Put in Bay. Right? No, and you'd have an economic advantage. Okay. So now what I want to think of this is when I solve this problem, this is like when they talk about those rankings, let's go back to the Swiss rankings. The deal was if we solve this, doesn't mean the other one is like automatically done. I'm not putting it in that category. The second category was if I do this, does it make it easier to do it? I'm putting it in that category. And the third one is if I do this, could really smart people at the Ostrom Institute figure out a way to make this work, right? So I'm in the middle one, where like there's some way, if we do this, we're greasing the skids. We're putting slope in the payoff. So how do I do this? I say, okay, remember, land, the water runoff is coming from the land to the water. So I'm assuming just the spillover of 1, no pun intended, literally is a spillover, right? Is just making the water problem 1 unit easier. So it means instead of being 4403, this thing is now 5513, right? It's just, hunting the stag looks a lot better. But that means instead of having to subsidize 2, this is again my son, really simple things to smart people, right? I'm only subsidizing 1, okay? Now let's go back and look at the domain externalities again, right? Now you realize if I've done land for 2, water for 1, now the economic thing is my work is done, right? Because the economic thing now looks like this, 773322. So now it's a dominant strategy to be collective. So this is kind of the happy story of the fact, let's ignore the responsible consumption. If we're in a world where there's a whole bunch of these things have positive externalities between them, right? If I did this in this sequence, land, then water, then economic, instead of costing me 6, right? It's only costing me 3. It costs me 2 to do the land. Oops, this should say it starts 2 to do this, 1 to do this, nothing to do that. So the sequencing here then becomes important. So when you think about like how do I sequence? So when you talk about, let's go back to the pathways thing by Sachs. One way to think about those pathways really carefully, first off, it would suggest there is no general pathway across all countries, right? Because all the externality maps are very different. It would mean that if we sat down and thought really carefully about which ones have big externalities on other ones, we could choose those first, right? Lower the cost of the other, and it would cost us a lot of money. So again, this comes out at the end of the day to how big are these domain externalities? We can draw those giant maps, but if the magnitude is tiny, it doesn't matter. But if the magnitude is big, we can save some money. So you can prove some simple claims. If I had a directed chain of externalities, right? So if A causes B, A to B to C to D to E, so just a straight line, then the minimal subsidy is achieved by subsidizing domains in the order of the chain. That's not surprising. And if I have a directed triangle like this, then the minimal way to do it is the way I talked about doing it: land, water, and then economically. Take the long path first. So those are externalities. So this, in some ways, methodologically, what we've been playing with is this notion of 2 different networks. And I'm going to go back to the work that, I don't know if Jenna gave it here, but the work Jenna and I've been doing is, suppose there's these behavioral spillovers. So suppose that in the economic domain, if that we get people to act collectivist, that's going to create this big spillover, this big delta for being collectivist in other domains. Because I'm like, this is the kind of person I am. I'm a good person, right? But in the land and water, since these aren't as central to my life, it's going to have a tiny spillover. And the way I'm going to model the spillover is the exact same way I modeled the externality, except for the spillover from each one goes to every other one. So it's not like there's just a spillover from so if I become more collectivist because of the economic thing, it makes me more collectivist everywhere else. So if I do the economic one and that gives me an extra, let's just say 1.5, then all the payoffs go up 1.5. So now the land one, which was 4,403, is now 5.5, 5.5, 1.5, 3. So if I do the economic one first, it's something like people are much more collectivist, but it's still the case that this would be the equilibrium in this game. We're not going to get pushed away, but it just takes a little bit of a boost to get me up. Okay. And then if I think of the water, after I do both the land and the economic, which are 1.5 and 2, 1.5, that adds up to 2. Now it's a dominant strategy to play stag. So I basically made it so we're collectivist in everything else. This is kind of like straight like my other work with Jenna, right? If I'm collectivist in everything else, it's just really easy to be collectivist in this other setting. Now, 2 super, super important to decide. One is I'm assuming additivity here, right? And maybe that this is a thing I think we have to really figure out. To what extent are these, what shape do these behavioral spillovers have, right? So it could be that there's a threshold effect. The other thing is I'm assuming a representative agent here, where there's probably massive heterogeneity in terms of how much, how receptive people are and how baseline collectivist people are versus and how much they're going to be affected by the behavior in other settings. But the point is, trying to keep this as simple as possible. And what you get here is you get that the minimal behavioral spillover, again, obviously, is going to be you order the domains from largest to smallest spillovers. Right? Big rocks first. Do the big ones, try and create as much collectivism as you can, and that's going to make it easier to do the other stuff. And I'm using collectivism here, but we could also, this could be trust, this could be lots of other stuff. Okay, so now, here's where here's where you can go down a rabbit hole, and I could never leave this rabbit hole for the rest of my life if I didn't want to. You could just basically say, let's start drawing different externality graphs, and let's draw different spillover graphs, and let's solve for the optimal, right, ordering. Now it gets a little harder, right? Because here's D4 is the big one. I'm going to say these are all the same size, and this one's just got some plus G. It's a little bit bigger. And D1 goes to 2, D2 goes to D4, D3 goes to D4. These are the same size. This is a different size. So now the easy stuff. Now my son is like, oh, he's actually doing something hard here, right? Because now this becomes a little less trivial. It turns out that right away you realize, this D1 doesn't matter because all it's going to matter is that it's just the relative size. And since these are all the same size, I set this up so that'd be easy. And this is just going to depend on the relative size of this relative to that. So if I can benchmark this at kind of like B, right? And then just do B1 to relative to B. And then you can do a lot of math, not that much math, and you can get, okay, here's what happens. If G is big, right? So if remember D4 was one that had the biggest spillover. So if G, which is the behavioral spillover gain is really big, you do 4 first. If G is really small, since 4 is kind of at the end of this chain, then you start to do you do 4 later, right? But you do 4 last if B1, 2 is really big. Then you're going to choose to do 1. Yeah. So what you get is these maps kind of make sense, which is good. But then you also get I could only do this map if I knew this. Right now, my former student Myra's in my ear going, this is why you need local participation in deciding on goals. Because if you have this map wrong, right, you're going to get the order wrong. And the differences in costs could be fairly substantial. So now you got to ask, can you prove anything, right? So let's first do this. Let's suppose I have a chain externality. So a chain externality is 4 goes to 2, 2 goes to 1, and the only externalities are like this, right? unless those spillovers are ranked, I'm just going to rank the spillovers D1, D2, D3. So now it turns out there's a little trick in here. If I have any consecutive domains that are this, in the externality sequence, so that are the same as this, if I have 2 points to 3 down here, or B3 there, I can just treat them as one thing. Because they're essentially one, right? Because one has a bigger spillover than the other, and it points to the other. So I can just like lump those together. So all I have to do is, if this is a sequence of K prime, this is a sequence of length N, I can reduce it to a sequence of length K, where each one is like non-consecutive. And then the total number of partial orderings here that could possibly be optimal is just 2 to the K. But this is a huge savings, right? Because if I started out with a thing of length 8, 2 to the 8th is a huge number, right? It's 256, it's just a lot to figure out. And if this drops it down to 5, there's only 32 I'd have to look at. And so you can start thinking, okay, well, that seems reasonable, right? So here's an example, like, there's 240 orderings here. I've got this list, but I can treat 1 and 2 as basically the same thing, and 4 and 5 is the same thing. So now I've only got 3 of these things left. 3 little externalities that aren't consecutive. So there's only 8 possible paths I'd have to look at out of the 240. So depending on what it looks like, you can reduce it a lot, and you can also prove theorems if it's a fan. So what you can do now is I went back and looked at all those externality graphs. There's a lot of chains. There's also a lot of fans, right? You can also, I'm not going to bore you with math, but you can also prove things about fans. And there's also a lot of little triangle things off the side. You can also prove theorems about little triangle things off the side. So let's just do a quick simulation just for fun. Like 10 domains, right? And we'll do it this way. Oops. So it's a stag hunt. And of each domain, I can just figure it's got a switching threshold. I'm going to make the heterogeneity here. So I'm going to make the mean 40 with a standard deviation of 4. So most are between like 32 and 48 is how much I'd have to subsidize to switch it. Each domain has a behavioral spillover that's between 0 and 2. So on average, they're just 1, right? And then spillovers affect all other domains symmetrically, right? So if I had a spillover of 1, I make everything and I do it. If I switch it to stag, everything's cost goes down by 1. And then for each ordered pair, I don't know what happened here, I'm letting only one of these things is positive, either Bij or Bji, because that's, if I look at the data, there's very few things that are pointing back at each other in opposite directions. And so I'm going to assume half the time it's small and half the time it's relatively big. And I've got to rule out diagonal elements because otherwise I'm building in like some sort of positive p-value. So here's a simple example where the spillovers are 0, 2. And what's interesting is and by the way, this is like amazing. I mean, just to give you a sense of how fast you can do things now, like this morning at 6:45, I thought, I wonder how quickly I could like write a program to do this. And the answer, so this was 17 minutes later, right? So this is 10,000 simulations. And by the way, this takes 0.83 seconds to run. But that's a super powerful computer. It's not. So this is just the distribution of 10,000 runs. This is just ordering them by behavioral spillover. I think this is an interesting sort of question. Suppose you had a sense of the magnitude of behavioral spillovers and a sense of the magnitude of the externalities. If the behavioral spillovers are roughly the size of the externalities, which they were there, just getting the behavioral spillover right, if the other ones are random, gets you way down here, way at the part of the distribution, which becomes then you can ask, it might not even be worthwhile to be spending that much time in the externalities, except for the really big ones, because they all do kind of, maybe cancel out. This is hill climbing 25 tries. So just flip things 25 times randomly, not even directed. And this is flip 100 times. And this is typically the case. If you hill climb, you typically get, you think of 10,000 tries like 2.7 standard deviations or something, right? So now let's lower the spillover. So now you can say, Scott, you totally overestimated the size of the spillover. So now the spillovers are only half. It's still the case that just doing the ordering by the spillovers, because they spread out over everything, right, gets you well down over here. Now the hill climbing helps you a lot more. expect that. And again, the 50 tries, you wouldn't have to do A/B testing here. This is just, I think, of experts in a room saying, what if we switch this order, right? But then if I make the spillovers huge, then I'm like, I mean, again, huge 0, 3. So the same magnitude as the externalities, you get, the hill climbing doesn't really help much at all. But you just ignore the externalities. Then I can say, here's the baseline case with the spillovers at 0.2. I can say, what if I ramp up the domain externalities? So I'm going to make large externalities. So before they were half the time 0 to 0.4, and the other half the time 0.8 to 1.2. Now I'm making them 0 to 1 and 2 to 3. The spillovers are still 0 to 2. And now you get that it doesn't help you that much, right? With the ordering, and the hill climbing helps you a ton. So again, the way to think about this is if I want to have these people sitting around thinking about what order do we do things with the SDGs, where do we start, how much, I think we probably at least want to think a little bit about, are there behavioral spillovers? Because even if they're not large, right? Even though large, it might be a decent order to start with, but if they are large, they explain a lot. Okay, so what do we learn from this simple exercise? So one is, if you show me those maps, even though they're complicated, if you were pretty confident, it'd be really easy to simulate it and figure out the optimal path. You can think about what the right path is. Even though those graphs are crazy complicated, there's still make certain assumptions you can do the path. Normally, if you wanted to like a theory about this and like a robustness of path, you want to have some sort of overlapping directed graph theory. You want to say, here is the externality graph, and here is the behavioral spillover graph. And the behavioral spillover is, going back to what I started with, is kind of like a systems effect in a way, because it's going through the whole thing. Ordering by behavioral spillovers is usually when the effect is small. And the other thing is small numbers of policy experiments are really useful here in a lot of cases, right? Things that. Okay, I want to do one other thing super quickly, and then we'll open up for questions. Is this is a massive simplification, and the other thing I've been working on in the space is to think about. There's three kind of core ways to make a decision, to make a market hierarchy deliberation, or through self-organization, right? But I'm going to leave that off because I can only do 3 in a reasonable graph. And if you look at things like trust, right? This is trust on this axis. This is inequality on this axis. This is GDP on this axis, trust on this axis. That we know trust is really good, correlates really strong with GDP and with lower inequality. So what you could think of, let's go back to this. Like I was saying, like if you can somehow incentivize people to be collectivists. An alternative way to think about this thing is I could say, if I choose something that's a market, I'm going to get a lot of individualism, I'll get some trust. If I do something that's deliberative, and you can think of this as either kind of democracy or, community-based planning, I'm going to get a lot of trust, but less individualism. And I'm just going to draw hierarchy down here. I'm going to say less individualism and maybe not as much trust because everything's right. People get less information. So then I can think about if I had, now imagine I've got 50 institutions. So the idea here, the agenda I've been playing with for a long time is think about, let's start with DNA. Like DNA is, you've got ACTGs everywhere, right? In the helix. In society, what you've got is you're basically choosing market, hierarchy, democracy, or no institution, right? Across all sorts of allocations and decisions. But instead of being a double helix, it's some network in terms of whether this one's connected to the other one. So across society, I'm throwing out about a bunch of M, H, and Ds, right? If I were 100% M's, this would be my culture. If I were a third, this would be my culture. If I'm mostly markets, and then next most hierarchies and third most democracies, my culture is somewhere in here, in this individual and trust. Does that make sense? I'm just basically mapping the distribution of these types of institutions into culture. But then I could ask, suppose I take an arbitrary decision. I've got to allocate classrooms, I've got to allocate food, anything. And I want to think, which institution should I use? Well, let's go back to the Petri dish. If culture matters, the choice of institution depends on the culture, right? So the culture is really individualistic, right? With moderate trust. It may be that markets are kind of the right way to go. It could be if it's not at all individualistic and really high trust, I should go with democracies. And in between here, maybe hierarchies work best. So then I can solve for like a fixed point. Gustavo and I were talking about this lesson at dinner. Alignment or congruence would mean that these maps match, right? So in this region right here, this is a culture in which markets are most represented, hierarchy second, democracy's third. And this is the region where markets perform best, hierarchies perform next best, and democracy performs next best. So this is, if I just let this system run, right, I end up in this region. If I were in this region, I'm gonna have mostly democracies, right? But I'm sorry, so if I were here, I'd have all democracies. But if I have all democracies, what performs best? Hierarchy, right? I'm gonna move towards hierarchy. So this is the only place I could get. The system is gonna go there. Well, so here's what's kind of interesting. Here's where I am right now. Let's suppose here's another picture. And here the two stable points are regions are either hierarchy democracy markets or hierarchies markets democracy, right? Because here's where democracy works best. Here's where markets work best. And my cultural production, the simplex, never produces the culture to support those two things, right? Suppose though I made democracy kind of better, like it could perform better, right? It's some innovation. That's going to move this line out because now the region where democracy performs best works, and I could get a new region. So intuition here, which is interesting, if an institutional type because of technology becomes better, there's more of a possibility I could use it. That makes sense, right? Perfect sense. Here's what doesn't make sense, which is kind of a bummer. If an institution gets better at making culture, useful culture, that's not true. So here's things initially, right? So here's democracy, hierarchy, market, and I've got two regions where there's fixed points. Down here, right, where I've got mostly markets, I'm creating a lot of trust. And here, where I've got mostly hierarchies, right, things are fine. Oops, you can't see this because this is in the way. I can move this. Maybe you can move this. You move it? That didn't move it. I think you have to. But if I make it so that markets.
You go with
There you go.
private.
Yeah. There we go.
It's better?
Hey, better. All right. So if I make markets suddenly produce more trust and more individualism, two things that markets like, I get rid of this region. And so what's strange is when you just start drawing these maps, the comparative statics on the institution performing better work as you'd expect, right? If the institution can leverage culture better, I'm going to use it more often. The comparative statics on it producing more of useful cultural traits, you can prove anything you want, right? Because what you're doing is you're producing more of those traits, and it depends on which institutions eat them. So it's the difference between producing culture and leveraging culture. And then we were talking about this at dinner last night. I'm not kidding. There we go. So first of all, you can get like multiple alignments really easily, right? This is like a Kandinsky talk, if you are right. So you can just get all sorts of alignments if you want. And you can also get, oops. Right here. Look, this could be kind of terrible. This is like lowest possible trust. This is what I should have low individual. Like, so that you actually, there's no reason to think that the equilibrium are anywhere close to efficient. And the reason why is because you're basically looking at the point where leveraging culture and balancing culture match. Leveraging culture and producing culture match. What you really want is you want the institutions that are producing, like if you really want a lot of trust, you want a lot of democracy. But the problem is, if the hierarchy is better at leveraging that democracy, you get more hierarchies, right? So you're not, equilibrium is where leveraging and production equalize. What you really care about is producing the useful culture, which means so the one thing that comes out of these graphs is you really want to think about choosing institutions not based on their efficiency in that moment, but taking into account also the culture that they produce. Okay, so two finalizing sides. So from this one, what do we take away? First is that massive inefficiencies are possible, right? Because the institutions you choose are the ones that basically are best at leveraging the culture. So there's a bias towards parasitic institutions, right? And we saw this during COVID. Like I presented this at Stanford Business School, and everybody was like immediately going, "Oh my gosh, this is what happened during COVID." Like working at home worked really well. You just ate the culture that you'd spent 20 years producing, right? And then all of a sudden, life was bad. You get multiple equilibrium here without any curvature. You're like, what was going on there? These were all straight lines. I just want to, that's happening because what's really going on is the payoffs implicit in kind of like the payoff function is going to be a curvature, right? There's intuitive comparative statics on the institutional performance, but there's non-intuitive comparative statics on the total production. You kind of need to really have better. There's the full paper has all these micro foundations to really understand how alignment comes about. You can write a micro level model. But you again get this is kind of a stuff with Jenna that the path dependence matters. And then the general takeaways are this. I mean, again, I was trained as a mechanism design person, and you take behavior, you take kind of like behavior is fixed. You assume Nash behavior. You take beliefs as a primitive. You take social networks, connectedness, levels of trust. All that stuff is like part of the environment. These things all matter, right? I strongly believe that interventions and institutional choices are going to affect these things. It's just a question of how much, right? These SDGs exhibit country level, I should have exclamation marks in BL font, externalities and systems effects, right? Now, the pathways, and I've got perhaps here again, because this isn't in any way empirical, should take these beliefs, behaviors, and networks into account, right? And I think the benefit, part of the reason I joined Brookings this year was they have this thing called 17 rooms where they go into a country and they have people focusing on each one of the 17 SDGs. And then like they pull people out of the rooms. Like if they realize like the water room should be talking to the responsible growth room, they pull those people out. And we were joking that it should be called 16 rooms with the sustainability person at the coffee machine in the hallway. This is essentially what happens, right? In every one of these things, everybody's like, oh, we need to go talk to the sustainability people. But so one way to think about what I'm trying to get at here is that I think that the measurement of the externalities in the SDGs, a lot of that is looking at kind of like physical domain stuff. And because we were talking about this at dinner last night, culture and behavior and networks and things move more slowly. Those might not be like the COVID case of sucking out human capital. Those things may not be caught in the correlational data. And so I think we have to, I think it's worth at least contemplating this seriously. The other thing is that when you draw those maps differently, I can change very few. If I change 10% of the nodes in the graph, the optimal sequencing changes a ton, which is a really strong argument for kind of local knowledge playing a huge role. Now, the optimal path changes a ton. Payoffs, you'd think, maybe don't change a ton, but they actually can, right? Because if I make one thing super important in a culture and has a big effect on culture, that just really lowers the cost of everything going down. And then I think the last thing is that then there becomes this question of like, how do we come up with good algorithms or processes by which we can switch orderings, because that matters a lot, right? Think of those, again, totally stylized distributions of total cost, right? If you just make assumptions, I've got 247 nodes and I've got 66, or I've got 466 arrows between them, and they're each one is like 3% of the value of the node. You quickly get that like the path can matter up to like 40% of total cost or something, right? So it probably matters. All right, let me stop there and we'll have time for questions.
I'm gonna, type your questions online for those of us online, and I'll try to keep track. But as is tradition, this question, Darren grad student.
For the wonderful talk. I know nothing about running mathematical models or graphs, but I think I learned a little bit about how to read graphs first. And that's also relevant to my question about I think I was really amazed by how detailed and complex the SDG related graphs are.
It's amazing. No, it's amazing.
The colorful ones.
Yeah.
But they're also they're really complex, but they're also obscure at the same time. for someone who's like, I don't know much about how to read those graphs,
Mm.
but also as from the sort of science perspective, how are they helpful? Like, how do we do that? There's already like a bunch of steps and processes to generate behind all these graphs. People have put work into generating these maps and graphs in complex systems. But also I think from the perspective of using them, interpreting them. Like, what would your take on?
It's a great question. So there's a famous graph of the situation in Afghanistan. Everybody saw this that made the front page of the New York Times like 10 years ago. It had this massive graph of what was happening in Afghanistan. It had like the drug trade, it had local government, it had tribal governments, it had insurgents, it had it's all different, it's all color coded in different ways. So one way to think about these graphs, and this is how I think about it, is think of it like I'm older, so when I was in computer science, we had these computer punch cards that had little holes in it. And so if you're trained, depending on what you're trained, you're not looking at that whole map. You're looking at just like a subset. It's like you're putting a filter over it and only looking at some things. And so there's two ways in which these graphs are really useful. One is you can suddenly realize that it's not that you're looking through a glass darkly. It's more the case that your house doesn't have the right windows in it. So for example, if you're looking at things like crime or health and you're an economist, you might find that like you might have survey data that shows self-control correlates a lot. And you take that as a given, so you think that's nothing you can do. If you're someone who works in public health, you know that lead in the water, the huge effect in the atmosphere has a huge effect on self-control, but that's not in my window box, right? I don't see that. And so I completely miss a solution. So the first place where these things are really useful is by having not just drawing the full graph, but having experts come in and then having people look at what they know and looking kind of node adjacent. And when you look node adjacent, what you're doing is you're saying, what was I taking as exogenous that somebody else takes as endogenous? So that's the first big win from these things. Because I'm with you. When I first started saying these things, I thought, wow, somebody's tax dollars are going to this, right? The second thing that's a big win, and somebody did this with the Afghanistan graph, is you can basically put an X through everything where you have no affordances. There's nothing you can do about it, right? Or that it's just prohibitively costly to do. So now I've suddenly got a graph with, it looked at some of those with, instead of having 127 nodes, I may have 14 nodes. And now I've only got 14 nodes. If I actually had a model, now we're in a world very similar to the one I just drew. Suddenly it's comprehensible, right? Suddenly and somebody actually did it with the Afghanistan map. They just made some limiting assumptions, some assumptions about the size of the effects. They crossed out everything that was like nothing you could do about it. And they showed like, wow, there's actually only like 4 reasonable policies here. And so you suddenly go just by a 2-step process. Here's what we think it looks like. Here's the things we can't control. Now we're down to 8 nodes, more passes 8 factorial, but when we see which ones are positive and negative, I can run a computer through it and I can say, like that thing I showed, the K thing, they didn't do. Part of the reason I did that kind of thing, like what are the set of possible optimal nodes? I think you can actually do some graph theory and say, or sequences, and figure out what the possible optimal policies are. So even though they seem unuseful and in full form they can be really useful, right? Again, getting you to see things that other people think of as endogenous that you think of as exogenous, and then also just letting go of the things you have to let go of because you can't fix them. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't think it's a really interesting talk. As I think a lot about measuring poverty, and if you look at the MDG, like the multidimensional poverty, poverty index, you see that they like put on these index child mortality and having no dirt floors in your house basically. Right. They weight them equal. And okay, so how do we decide what the value of achieving one objective is? It seems like you need a whole nother layer top of what you've got to say, actually, like saving a child's life is more important than having a dirt floor. Right? And it doesn't really matter what people think about it. It's not just a matter of what the culture is in a place, or your decision to make a policy based on that is that could be questioned. But my main question is actually about is, the simplifications implicit in the graph there. It seems like there's just a huge amount of assumptions that are probably, almost unknowable. Like, would it be better to reduce poverty, or focus on clean water or crime? Like those questions are so huge, and you can't possibly get enough experts in the room not to like miss something. Maybe it's the lead, or maybe it's something else. Like, we have to make policy decisions, sure, but how does simplifying it to like the level of these graphs actually, like, in the real world, we're going to get it vastly wrong, even in like weighting those two variables. Right? Not only because we're missing the value dimension, but just even if we agreed on the value dimension.
So yeah, so there's two. So one is right. So this, I looked last year. I didn't look, but like last year when I looked, there were in the previous 5 years there've been, I think, 14,000 papers written on, sort of multidimensional decision making. Right? No, and there's different ways you can do. Like you can do like equal weighting. You can have some sort of an ideal, and you can do distance to the ideal. Right? This is where like people like Delphi method stuff, like you've got to figure out some way, if I'm in 17 dimensions, let alone 247, how do I,
right?
Yeah, no, even right. How do I decide what those trade-offs are, right? So I think that, but the other thing though, I mean, and one reason where these maps can be useful, and this is Moira, my student who's giving a talk last week, was saying, there are clear wins. Clear wins often take two forms. One is there are things where one just Pareto dominates another, like it's just a better policy. Those are rare, but there are. But the other thing that happens in these things, she was saying that when she studies flooding, and what people realize is that we were all laughing. She goes, this is a deep but obvious point. When there's flooding, it's usually raining. Okay, that's deep. We're like, got it, right? And then she's like, no. The reason that matters is when there's flooding, you've got to be getting rid of storm water at the same time you're preventing waters from rising. And those are a giant negative externality. And so your solution has to recognize that both parts of those system, right, are in play at the exact same time. And when people realize that, a lot of their ideas for what to do suddenly become really bad ideas. So if you run a simple simulation where you're showing water running off at the same time water's rising, right? Your idea to just divert more water causes the water, so there's a question. I mean, this at the end of the day, this boils down to, is expert knowledge in any way useful? Right. And I think that like this is why one reason looking at this data has been kind of compelling to me, and is measured in very different ways. These externality maps are wildly different across place. And so let's take gender inequality. In a lot of the regions of the world, that looks like that's a big one. Like fix this, and you get a lot of positive spillovers.
It's just important to fix it independently of the positive spillovers.
Well, no, but if you care about, even if you don't care about that, even if you didn't care about gender inequality, which some of these male economists may not, it helps everything else, right? So when you draw the map, even if you didn't care about it, people can have different opinions about what they care about. We can argue about that, but that's still going to matter. In Switzerland, it doesn't matter, because the levels, it's already there, right? And so again, you've got to understand, like, and I'm saying you have to, but I think that in people trying to solve the problem, it boils down to, I think, can we identify the big arrows in these graphs? And can we then, if we can identify the big arrows, can we sequence the right way? I mean, I'm with you. I'm super skeptical about this stuff, but at the same time, though, I feel like compared to how we do things, compared to just somebody who's got power sitting around making a decision without any data, without any modeling knowledge at all, without any understanding of how things relate to one another, it seems to me, I have to believe that it would be better to have knowledge.
It seems like the quality of data really affects these, because you're like, well, we don't have data in that, so we're going to leave it out. But maybe that's where the important thing is, right? And so data only goes so far, and the quality of the output, like, it can't be better than. So, I mean, I don't know that it depends who the decision maker is. How much do they know? You know what I mean? Like how much is their knowledge base? What experts are available to them? Is it a deliberative process? Like there's a lot of other ways of making decisions that could produce better outcomes. And so we need empirical data to establish that yours is a good.
Oh, yeah. No, and I'm not saying this is, I'm not saying this is the way, but the thing is, but if you have another process that is ignoring, so Elizabeth Pop Berman, who's one of my colleagues, is a wonderful book on like what the title of it's called, because I always call it like why economists have too much power, because that's the subtext. And she basically argues it's for two, one, they've data, like, and like you don't have data on this behavior networks, culture stuff that's as clean. And the other thing is they typically give like a single solution. They're like, okay, they don't say it's complex, right? So one of the things you want to think about is, are there ways, this sort of approach is much more inclusive in a sense that you're saying, look, there are other ways of knowing, there's other things that matter. You know, at a minimum, you're forcing the economists to put their model up there, and other people can say, hey, wait, you're taking this as exogenous and these other things are going to affect that. I mean, I think that part of this is that, you know, you always kind of like think, what did my advisors get wrong? And, you know, my advisors who shared the Nobel Prize basically said, take as fixed belief, behaviors, networks, trust levels, technologies, and design an institution that gives you outcomes. Those are all the things they could measure. And culture never shows up in there, right? Nor does the effect of the institutions on changing that. So one thing I'm trying to do is like in that space, just trying to say like, wait a minute, these things, look at the variation you see across these other measures. Look how much, you know, these cultural dimensions, look how much those things affect the behavior of institutions. You shouldn't design institutions or make policy without taking those things into account. Now, the question is this kind of a scientific participatory modeling approach the right way to go? I don't know. I think there's domains where it is. The three talks we've had recently at the university, I would say the consensus, and I put myself firmly in the middle of the consensus is that you have to ask what percentage of those arrows are physical things that like, I mean, like, are things that we could like measure with physics, like water flow, right? And things like that. When that number gets really high, these things work, right? So like the agent-based models of the spread of the pandemic worked really, you know, incredibly well because like, you know how a virus spreads, right? But also tight culture mattered a lot there, right? So that was something you had to include. So if you're doing flooding, if you're doing traffic, if you're doing that sort of stuff, this stuff works, right? Because you're relying on kind of laws of physics that aren't going to break. But when you start suddenly getting in a world about like, so people who've tried to do this for organizational change, it's been a train wreck because it's all happening in a cognitive space and it's all, nothing's that measurable. So I think it's an open question.
Read Eduardo next.
Thank you, Scott. This was fascinating way to think about that. One of the things that the SDG kind of allows you to do is to think at different levels.
Right.
You know, you can think as a country, you can think as a community, you can think as a university. So I wonder if you could share with us your mental process. When you're thinking about a model like this, you're thinking, you know, sort of configuration of market democracy, hierarchy, or externalities. How do you match that to an empirical reality when you're thinking through it?
Well, so, you know,
and the same goes for culture, for the
so,
idea of loose and tight culture. You know, how do you contrast this with Lake Erie, you know, the US, or you know what I mean? What's your thinking process in looking at that model against some kind of empirical?
Yeah. So again, so like, I mean, as Jess was saying, she introduced me like you gotta like, you pick where you think you can like help people, right? And so for me, like a lot of it has been like presenting this to different audiences and then say like, so one thing I did for like 3 years, I'd present the SDGs to people and I'd say, put these in categories. And it's wild. If you go to Silicon Valley, they have two categories: things tech can fix and things tech can't fix. But their set of things tech can fix is larger than anybody else, right? And then if you go to other people, it's kind of like there's people, planet, and tech or infrastructure, right? But then I was showing it to my wife and she was first looking at Jenna and she's like, oh yeah, this is like local, state, and national, right? And so there's like, and so at one point I had a talk on this, like 15 categorizations of the SDGs, right? I mean, they've got like, and that relates to the computer card thing in a way, right? In the sense that like, you think about like, depending on who you are, you think about these things in very different ways. And so on the one hand, so when I think about the data, I think about kind of like we can't possibly absorb all those externalities. Like we just can't, it's too much information for us to absorb the externalities. But what you want is people who are putting these things in different categories and are keenly aware or become aware or try and gather data or try and make the case, whether that's through narratives, whether it's through histories, whether it's through just logically thinking it through. Where are these big spillover, right? And even like what causes like behavioral spillovers? Like I used to teach this stuff on like the importance of trust, but then all the trust research was done by people who cheated.
Yeah.
That was Ariely and Francesca Gito. It's like, great. I just realized like I was putting together my syllabus like last year. I'm like, well, this is good. This is going to work well because like I can't even trust the ethics research. So I think one thing I'm trying to think about empirically in a deep way is to what extent, what's the magnitude of things? And I think that like as social scientists, like I moved over to the business school partly because like this collective intelligence class I was teaching was drawing engineers and business students. And those are the two schools that make money at the university. And so like LSNA wasn't happy paying my salary for the other people. So I was like, fine, I'll move to, I was either gonna move to public policy engineering or business. And the thing that's interesting there is like I see a lot of psychology talks and they don't care. This is going to sound a damning criticism with that. They don't care that much about magnitude. The coin of the realm is come up with a construct and get significance. And they don't care about magnitude. And I think here, the coin of the realm seems to be drawing these arrows. And I think that no, we really need to think about magnitude. We really need to ask, if it's separable, we can do it by silos. But like what you hear over and over and over, all this data gathering and stuff like that, like it's clear these things are interdependent in big ways. So what I'm trying to think about empirically is, sure, there's an externality, but how big is it? And I think the cultural stuff is very hard. Like we were talking about this last night with students with ChatGPT. It's so easy not to cheat. I don't think it was cheating anymore. I think it was like having an AI helper. I think 2 months ago I was thinking it was cheating, but it's like putting donuts in front of everybody and saying, don't eat all day, right? I mean, it's impossible not to do it. So, but it does lead to like, is that going to affect culture?
Just follow up. I mean, whether you think would be an interesting way to test this. So you have two, let's say to simplify, two dominant ways to look at the SDGs.
Yeah.
You have one group that says, tackle the basic capabilities first.
Right.
SDG 1 to 5 and others with, tackle social capabilities that should have that kind of, triggering effect,
right.
A positive spillover on the other capability. The other group argues that, tack the basic environmental dimensions, and that provides conditions for people to pursue their capabilities
right.
in whatever way they can. So those are two very different philosophical kind of entry points to the SDGs. Maybe that's something that you could sort of, test in your.
I would be. I mean,
have the biggest.
Yeah. And I don't think you're going to get the right. Like I'm a big fan of like writing all sorts of different models of all sorts of different types, right? And and there's also a challenge between kind of like, models and narratives, in these cases, in the sense that like models are kind of hewing you to logic that like a narrative doesn't. And it's also the magnitudes all have to be internally consistent with one another. I think that you probably could, in some cases, figure out that like some sequences could make more sense than others. But I guess the one thing that my initial reaction when people do stuff like that is I think that unless when I looked at that graph, it really broke. Like if I did a community, so let's download all of those graphs and all those different colors, and then let's do a community detection algorithm to say, does it really divide into those two types of categories cleanly? Like there's the kind of the human side and the environmental side. If it did, then I'd be willing to buy that one of those two is the right approach. But if when I do community detection, I got, and again, I'm assuming I got all the networks right, that I get that, no, there's a lot of things going across between the two, then I'd say there's no way that either of those two are right. It's got to be something more subtle. But again, this is, yeah, this is kind of like, we have to rely on simple things. There's also a question of like, is it politically even feasible to do these things? Yeah.
We had Gustavo, and then I got a couple online.
Okay, great.
So, well, I really enjoy your presentation, so this was fantastic. So maybe a follow up on this idea of political implications or feasibility in terms of political equilibrium. Can this be interpreted as an argument in favor of centralization? So those small communities, they essentially they are really missing all those links, which are the ones that really matter. So the best they can do is transmit the information to the center, let the center take care of all those linkage and implement the best policy. Now that we also have systems that can also compute the right policies, and now suddenly this looks to me like a solid argument for centralization. What are we missing? Or maybe not. Maybe it's an argument for centralization. And then some of the technological changes that we have seen in data analysis will be favoring centralization.
Yeah, so yes and no. First of all, you're raising a huge issue. And I'll come back to that. But first, let me look at it this way. I think that when you take Jenna's view of this, what is local, what is regional, what is national. So when you look at those externality maps, there are some things that aren't pointing, if you get it right at the local level, and you want to kind of get it right at the local level, you can draw boundaries around it, right? So, and when you think about that, this hill climbing thing, one of the things about giving local control and one of the things about local processes that aren't using these maps, that are people saying, hey, why don't we try this different way? If you think of this as the benefits from experimenting locally, right? Those things can be huge. And so the extent to which the local problem is different from the national problem, the regional problem, the amount that hill climbing can help you just generally from a long time looking at when you take these high dimensional spaces, amazing how quickly, and not even just here, but across hundreds and hundreds of models, how very quickly hill climbing gets you 9, 10 standard deviations above them. You just do way better. And so to the extent that my first reaction would be carve out whatever you can locally and let the local community, and then if you have high trust and if you have a functioning local government, if you've got that sort of thing, then the locality should do really, really well. But this goes back to kind of Alesina's sort of work. There's kind of returns to scale at the level of policy. And so, but quickly on the broader question, so the NSF funds 4 conferences through CEME. The one that I've been running for 25 years is on the decentralization conference. And the genesis of that conference was, what works better, central planning or markets? And the answer ended up being markets because they use less information and we couldn't possibly process all that information. And there's a bit of a crisis in that community now because we can process all that information. So all of the theories that they somewhat right-wing economists used to argue for markets over central planning, their core argument no longer hold, right? So nobody's happy about that, right? But it's
maybe just a quick follow-up. Yeah. It's so what if you take your model and you add kind of a little bit of political economy in the following sense is, do you want to restrict so imagine that you have 2 levels of government, local and then one. So the advantage of the central government is that it's more likely to take into account some of those linkages. But then maybe for political economy reasons, you also want to restrict. So maybe the message is, hey, what you want is the federal government or the national government or the upper level to focus on those things that open the door for the local ones, okay? So, and that gives you potentially a different constitution. It's a constitution that restricts in a very particular way what the upper level of the government can do, and that open the door institutionally to the local governments in a very different way. It's now you need the federal government or the upper level to allow you to, start doing something at the local level. And that I think could be a much more interesting story institutionally.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just one step from what you are doing. It's probably even cheap from the point of view of the formalities, no?
Yeah, I know. Jenna talks about this a lot in terms of like we've been in Iowa for a while, and like there's these giant pig farms, and they just put their effluent down the river because that's Missouri. They don't care, right? And so there's where you do need like a bigger boundary there. So you need general dog, you probably need the central government on this local stuff to ask, are there big? So let's draw the big map again, just metaphorically, right? Where are there big negative arrows coming out? And the federal government probably should say, no, you can't do that. And where are there big green arrows going out? I mean, what's interesting, I mean, being here in Indiana, a lot like Michigan, what we have given so much selflessly to California, in New York, in Oregon, in Florida, and those places, that we take our smartest children, send them to flagship state universities, and then send them to other states. Right? It's a massive positive externality of states. And the federal government, and part of the reason we continue to do that is like if we said people had to stay in the state, we probably would we rely so much on federal funds that we've now become kind of like federal universities in a way. It's smacked us across the face in the last, year and a half. But that's a case where we have a huge positive thing coming out of us, and the government has basically, encouraged us to do that. But like I had my students in my class walk around the business school the second day and say, is there anything in here that says you are in the state of Michigan other than an M? It could be Missouri or Maine or a lot of M states. But is there anything in here that says like, I'm from a state that has gorgeous Great Lakes. I'm from a state like that is pulling you back to Michigan or to serve the state in any way. And nobody found anything, and we know cultural artifacts and these things matter a lot, right? So we've kind of given up on the idea that we're training our smart people to stay in the state implicitly.
All right, I'm going to do
but we wouldn't if the payoffs were different.
do a lightning round really fast because we are getting
Okay.
close to one.
Yep.
So I've got a couple online that I'm going to try to condense, and then I think Armando had a question, and
Okay.
we're at. Okay, so the first question was a clarifying question about whether collectivism in the way that you're thinking about it includes also something like civic artisanship, in which it's not just providing or generating local knowledge, but actually co-designing institutions. So more of a clarification question there. Barb asked about how you're thinking about phase transitions and the particular characteristics in which, emergent characteristics are not predictable. And so, right, all of the characteristics, complex systems you're aware of. And then Dan had a question about the extent to which, Ostrom, Walker, and Gardner demonstrates how trust is built over time through multiple interactions on ordinary common problems. Doesn't that suggest it might be better to start small and go to larger problems? And then he had a question about whether, assuming that market institutions do not facilitate trust, but Dan, I think it's actually the other way around. They do facilitate.
They do,
trust.
yeah.
Yeah. So just so just to clarify. So those.
Yeah. So super quick. And the first one, like we're really agnostic about what the stag hunt is getting at. Like, is it collectivism? Is it all? I mean, it's kind of a stand-in for. We have the most recent paper is kind of like, I guess what we call kind of like civic capacity, which is kind of all those things. And there's a question of like we're being guilty of like collapsing down to one thing. The phase transition stuff, and the sheet here is like I've assumed a representative agent. As soon as I introduce heterogeneity, then you're in phase transition land, because it's kind of like you get some percentage of the population that's cooperating here and here and here, and then all of a sudden, like boom, the whole thing will go, right? And here I'm just having it all go in one fell swoop because there's a representative agent. And the question about like, shouldn't things be done locally? I think that's where empirically it's super interesting to think about, because if it is the case that the local stuff matters more, then we really should be focusing on building, the right type.
Flare it down in an institution or an electoral institution.
Yeah. Right.
All right, cool. Armando, you had a question?
Sure.
Way back there. Sorry.
Very thought-provoking framework. So I guess one takeaway for me you didn't mention would be for policy implications that we take interdependence seriously. But suppose we don't, and we have a targeted domain.
Yeah.
Then that could have unintended consequences. They could be positive. You emphasize the positive externalities, but they could also be negative.
Right.
They could be negative externalities. So I think this is a very useful framework to take that into account.
Yeah.
Now, my question is about the practical difficulties of uncovering the underlying graph, the network structure.
Yeah.
The chain.
And yet 120 countries are doing it as we speak.
If you think about the chain interventions, so you have a particular sequence, but then
Yeah.
it's a structure, right?
Yeah.
You can have cycles.
Yeah, you can do some, so yeah, I did,
The cycles will probably minimize the subsidy you need that will work in your favor if you have positive externalities, right?
yeah, they do. So like with the cycles, it goes down. It's 2 to the K, well, 2 to the K minus K, yeah. So you're right.
But the diagrams don't have, you have a chain, right?
Yeah, but this, yeah, right. No, if I put a cycle in, it would go down by even more, yeah.
Right, so, but wouldn't that imply that it would be really useful to know the whole network structure? Because then you might be able to leverage the centrality of a certain node or this higher level structure to be more effective, right? Like either more efficient because you don't have to spend as much with subsidies, or just exploit the network structure, let it, presumably this could be a dynamic structure as well. So it could be reinforce certain behaviors.
Right. No, it's a brilliant point. Like John List, his book, The Vortex Effect, right? You know, he does all the kind of like, he's a chair of Chicago's econ department where he does these natural experiments, and then he goes out and he finds that like generally they don't replicate, go someplace else. And oftentimes, even if they work, the system claws itself back. And I think one of the reasons the system claws itself back is these behavioral spillovers. I mean, you're subsidizing something that isn't consistent with people's behaviors everywhere else. And then you get, so it's kind of like you're pushing a ball partway up the hill, and then all these externalities are pulling it back.
Yeah, and the final point I would make is that you have a combination of positive and negative externalities.
Right. Yeah, and the negative ones are that so I'm only got the kind of positive thing in terms of like, collectivism begets collectivism. But if I'm in an individualistic society, right, like it's going to claw its way back, right? Like I've been trying to get my undergrads to do some things where like they're doing things to help the rest of the class. I know as the term wears on, that's going to be tough to sustain when they're like, sorry, I couldn't help you with your project because I'm working on mine, right? Yeah. There's clearly negative externalities. There's also this weird thing, like I feel, you are trying to, in some sense, you have some view of like what a good culture is, right, in a way. That's implicit in this, that you'd like to choose institutions that give you that. But I don't think anyone's in favor of low trust. The individualism, collectivism thing gets harder, but generally trusting is something you'd like to have, right? But when I talk to my philosopher friends, they're like, you can't study trust without forgiveness because humans are fallible. And it turns out we don't study forgiveness in these things. You have to, because trust won't work with failed agents if you don't have some level of forgiveness. And so we don't have forgiveness in these models. Thank you. Yeah. But you can forgive me for not having it in.